The wind across the Montana plains cut like a blade, carrying the sting of dust and the dry scent of scorched earth. At the edge of a lonely horse stop, a woman sat quietly, a small suitcase by her feet, a handkerchief soaked with tears. Isla Carter, a black woman from Boston, had been waiting 3 days in that red, blistering heat. 3 days waiting for the man who'd promised to marry her, who'd sworn to build her a home on this free land. But he never came. The sun poured down, turning her weary skin to bronze. The white parasol she'd brought from the east was torn and frayed, its lace edges singed by wind and sun. That morning, the station keeper, an old man with kind eyes, had said gently, "Miss, I can't keep a room forever for another man's promise. If no one's coming, you best think of something else." But Isla had nowhere else to go. She had sold everything, her small boarding room, her sewing machine, even her mother's wedding ring, to follow Henry Barrett, the man who wrote her tender letters and painted dreams of a ranch by the mountains, where wildflowers grew along a white fence. Now all that remained was dust. A gust of wind swept through, lifting her skirt and tangling her curls. Isla raised a hand to shield her eyes, but the tears still came mixing with the dirt on her face. Far down the empty road, there was nothing. No wagon, no rider, just the hollow stretch of her own disappointment. Then came a sound that cut through the wind. Hooves. Isla looked up. At the bend of the road, a rider appeared, his figure etched against the blazing sky. The man sat tall in the saddle, a long coat dusted with earth, a wide-brimmed hat shading half of a sun-darkened face. When he reined in before the station, their eyes met, slow, steady, and unflinching. "You've been waiting a long time," his voice came, low, rough, and strangely warm. Isla tightened her gloved hands. "That's my business, sir." He dismounted, his movements firm yet calm. The leather of his boots met the ground, kicking up a small cloud of dust. "Name's Boone Hale," he said, removing his hat politely. "And your business, Miss Carter, has become just about everyone's business in these parts." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean by that?" Boone met her gaze, his eyes serious but not unkind. "The man you're waiting for, Henry Barrett, he's not coming back. Not today. Not ever." She froze. You know him?" "Not personally," Boone said, his voice steady but hoarse. "I've been tracking him for nearly a year. Barrett's just one of the names he uses. He writes to women like you, spins them stories of a happy life, takes their savings and disappears." Isla's world cracked open. She stepped back, gripping the porch rail to keep from falling. "No, that can't be true. He loved me." Boone shook his head. "He only loved what he could carry away." The words landed, heavy as stone. Isla stood still, wind whipping her dress, eyes fixed on nothing but the mirage of her own broken hope. Her voice broke. "Then who are you in all this?" He answered simply, "I work with Pinkerton, and I'm also a cattleman. My sister was his first victim." Silence settled between them. The only sound was the wind humming through the eaves and the faint clink of reins against metal. Isla sank onto the wooden step, covering her face with her hands. Everything she'd trusted, every dream she'd sewn together, turned to ash. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered. Boone stood for a long moment before extending his hand. It was rough, sun-browned, calloused, but steady. "You stop waiting, Miss Carter," he said quietly, "and you start living again." Isla looked up. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but invitation, a chance. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, firm, and real. The wind rose again, sweeping away the thick dust around the porch, and in the blinding light of the Montana sunset, Isla Carter stepped out from the land of waiting, where her ending had just become her beginning. The afternoon stretched endlessly as they left the horse station, crossing miles of red-dusted ground. Isla rode the mare Boone had brought for her, body stiff, hands gripping the saddle as if letting go would make the whole world collapse. Boone rode ahead, a few paces in front, his back straight beneath a coat coated with pale dust. Every now and then he turned slightly, a brief glance just to make sure she was still there. The mountain road wound upward, the wind carrying the scent of pine sap and dry soil. Isla had never seen a place like this before. Too vast, too silent, where even the sound of hoofbeats felt like her own heartbeat echoing through the hills. When the sun began to sink behind the ridges, Boone halted. "We'll stop here," he said, his voice low and grounded. Isla looked around, a clearing among the pines, a small stream winding through, wild grass growing by the edge. Boone dismounted, tethered the horses, and built a fire. He worked with quiet patience, cutting wood, rinsing the canteens, spreading his coat on the ground as a seat. Isla still sat on her horse, uncertain, almost frozen. "Miss Carter," he called without looking up, "if you stay there any longer, that mare's gonna think she's bunking with you tonight." A weak laugh escaped her, dry, trembling. "I'm not used to any of this." Boone stepped closer and offered his hand. It was the first time their skin touched, brief but enough to send a sharp beat through Isla's chest. His hand was warm, firm, and smelled faintly of smoke and leather. "Now you're standing on Montana soil," Boone said quietly. "No reason to fear it." They ate by the fire, nothing more than hard cornbread and salted meat, but hunger and chill made it taste almost rich. Boone poured her a tin cup of strong black coffee, its bitter scent curling through the air. Isla took off her gloves, her small hands trembling as she held the metal cup. The firelight painted her skin the color of honey, and Boone found himself watching longer than he meant to. She noticed and lowered her gaze. "What are you looking at, Mr. Hale?" He cleared his throat and turned back to the fire. "Just thinking. Boston probably never had nights this quiet." Isla glanced around. The chirr of insects, the sharp pine air, the sky heavy with stars. For the first time, the world didn't feel entirely lost to her. "Have you lived here long?" she asked. "Most of my life," he said, voice rough but calm. "But I only truly understood it after I lost someone to him." Her head lifted. "Your sister, the one you mentioned this morning?" He nodded, eyes fixed on the flame. "She believed a man like Barrett. Left Wyoming chasing happiness. By the time I found her, all that was left was a grave." The fire crackled softly, throwing gold across his face, sharp lines, steady, but touched with sorrow. Isla wanted to speak, to comfort, but silence felt truer. Between them lay an understanding too heavy for words. At last she whispered, "I'm sorry, Boone." "Don't be," he said, shaking his head slightly. "It wasn't her fault. Wasn't yours either. Some men make a living out of stealing hope." The wind drifted through the trees, carrying the faint murmur of the stream. Isla pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Boone noticed. He rose, walked to his saddle, and brought her a thick blanket. "Sleep on that side of the fire," he said gently. "It's warmer and safer. I'll be on this side. If you hear anything strange, call out." She nodded. When he bent to spread the blanket, her hair fell forward. A few curls brushed against his hand. Boone paused for the briefest moment, then drew back, his jaw tight. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't answer aloud, only gave a small nod before lying down across the fire. Isla turned on her side, watching him through the flickering light, his face half lit, half shadowed, steady and still. In the quiet of the pine forest, she heard his slow breathing blend with the sound of running water. For the first time in days, Isla closed her eyes without fear. Perhaps peace didn't come from promises after all, but from someone who silently made her feel safe enough to rest. When dawn broke, Montana softened. The pale light slid through the pines, glazing the stones and wet grass with mist. Isla had imagined the west to be nothing but dust and loneliness, yet as they crossed the last ridge, the sight before her stole her breath. Below lay Hale Ranch, a wide valley with a clear stream curling through open pasture, small wooden houses scattered like quiet sentinels, thin smoke rising from chimneys. Farther off, cattle grazed lazily, their bells chiming in rhythm with the running water. Boone drew his reins and looked down at the land with the stillness of a man rooted to it. "We're here," he said softly. Isla followed his gaze. "Your ranch?" "Mine," Boone replied, then paused. "And the folks who work it with me." They dismounted before the main house, a sturdy two-story cabin with a steep roof and windows polished to a shine. On the porch stood a woman in her 50s, broad-shouldered, silver hair tied into a neat bun, wiping her hands on an apron. When she saw Boone, her voice carried both sharpness and warmth. "Where in heaven's name have you been for 3 days, Mr. Hale? I thought the snow took you." Boone smiled faintly, a softness easing his tone. "Martha, this is Miss Isla Carter. She'll be staying for a while." Martha's sharp eyes swept over Isla. The wrinkled gloves, the hem thoughts of her faded gray dress. Instead of judgment, she offered a small nod. "Another stray brought home by a man who can't mind his own peace," she said with a teasing grumble. "Come in, Miss Carter. You must be starving." Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Isla sat at the long table, hands trembling from exhaustion. Martha placed a bowl of hot soup and a slice of soft bread in front of her, then turned away, letting her eat in silence. Boone leaned against the doorframe, removing his gloves, eyes drifting across the home he'd kept for 10 years. It had always been too quiet, the kind of silence that swallowed a man whole. But now, with one stranger seated at his table, it felt somehow alive again. Later that afternoon, Boone led Isla to a smaller cabin behind the house, his sister's old room. The window opened toward a hill of pines, the bed neatly covered in wool blankets. "You can stay here," he said. "If you'd like, help Martha in the kitchen. As for me—" He hesitated, then added, "I could use someone to keep the books straight. They've been a mess for years." Isla smiled faintly. "I used to work at a bank. Numbers are about the only thing I still understand." That evening, they sat together in his small office. Boone opened the worn ledgers, pages yellowed and scrawled with uneven figures. Isla flipped through them with practiced hands, her pen moving with neat precision. Boone watched her quietly, his gaze catching on her fingers whenever they brushed the same page. Each time she pulled back, offering a shy smile, and he pretended not to notice. Outside, the sunset spilled gold across the valley. The light poured through the window, catching in her hair until Boone nearly forgot what he'd been about to say. "You handle this well," he murmured, clearing his throat. "The Boston Bank taught me how to read numbers that lie," Isla replied, eyes still on the ledger. Boone gave a quiet laugh. "Out here, people don't lie with numbers. They just hide their hearts." The air stilled between them. Isla lifted her gaze. For that moment, there were no roles, no savior, no debt, no distance. Only two souls, both betrayed once, both searching for something they didn't yet dare name. From the kitchen, Martha's voice broke the silence. "Dinner's getting cold, you two." Boone rose, his hand brushing the edge of the desk, as if to steady the moment. "Come on, Miss Carter. Martha doesn't like being kept waiting." Isla followed him out, her steps lighter somehow. The breeze caught a few loose curls around her neck. Boone turned, meaning to speak, but only smiled instead. That night, after Martha had gone to bed, Boone stood at the doorway, watching the soft yellow glow from Isla's window spill across the yard. It was warm, quiet, alive, and for the first time in years, his house no longer felt empty. Life at Hale Ranch moved quietly, like the streams that wound around the foothills. Each morning, Isla rose before dawn, helping Martha light the stove and prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. The scent of coffee, wood smoke, and the sound of roosters became the familiar rhythm of her mornings. At first, she fumbled through everything, spilling flour on the table, cutting her hands while chopping wood, startling the horses with her too soft steps. But each time she made a mistake, Boone only smiled, never once scolding her. "No one's born knowing how to live with the land," he said. "The land teaches us a little at a time." By afternoon, when the work in the fields was done, Boone often took her walking along the slopes, pointing out which grass was best for cattle, which soil stayed wet after rain, which fields should be plowed again. Isla listened and memorized, her hands stained with dirt, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. One day, he brought her into a small room where an old land map hung on the wall. "Look here," Boone said, tracing the faded lines with his finger. "Every mark is a vein of water, a boundary of hope. This land doesn't belong to me, Isla. I'm just someone it allows to stay." She was silent for a while, then smiled. "Maybe people are like that too. You can't claim them. You can only stay if they let you." Boone turned to her, eyes caught between surprise and quiet amusement. "I never thought of it that way." In the evenings, they worked together in his study. He taught her how to read the geological maps. She taught him how to balance accounts and write neatly. Boone was a slow learner but patient. Isla patient but often amused when his handwriting wandered across the page. "You write like you're wrestling yourself," she teased, her eyes gleaming. Boone raised a brow. "And you laugh like someone who knows she's winning." They both laughed, the sound soft and full, filling the room that had long known only the rustle of paper. There was no flirtation, no distance, only the quiet growth of trust between them. Then, one late afternoon, rain came sudden and hard. Boone's horse slipped on the muddy slope, throwing him to the ground. Isla, hearing the commotion from the kitchen, ran out. He managed to stand, his shoulder streaked with blood. "It's just a scratch," Boone said, voice rough with pain. Isla helped him inside as Martha hurried to fetch the antiseptic. When Martha left them alone, Isla removed his outer coat with trembling hands. Beneath the fabric was a long cut along his shoulder, blood seeping dark through the shirt. She cleaned the wound with warm water, the sharp scent of liquor rising between them. Boone closed his eyes, breath heavy, but when her hand brushed his skin, his eyes opened. Their gaze met, close enough for her to hear the steady thud of his heart in the hush between raindrops. "You don't have to bear it alone," she whispered, unsure if she meant the wound or something deeper. Boone's reply came low, almost tender. "I'm used to it. But having someone care, it's not the worst thing." When she finished bandaging him, Isla turned to fetch a blanket, but his hand caught hers. Not hard, just enough to make the world pause. Then he released her, his voice quiet. "Thank you." Night fell. Rain pattered softly against the porch roof. Boone sat by the fire, shoulder wrapped neatly, eyes half closed. Isla sat across from him, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The firelight danced over his face, half in shadow, half in warmth, softer than she'd ever seen it. Neither spoke. They simply listened to the rain, the crackle of the fire, and the calm between breaths. And in that stillness, Isla understood that trust wasn't born from promises. It was built in moments like this, when someone stayed without needing a reason. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of silence. She found peace in it. And as the rain fell steady outside, the firelight glowed in both their eyes, a quiet faith kindling like an ember in the heart of winter. That morning, the sun rose slower than usual. Weak light filtered through the fog, brushing the fields still damp from the night. Boone stepped into the study, his face shadowed in a way Isla had never seen before. On the desk lay a crumpled envelope, the Pinkerton seal still fresh. "What is it?" Isla asked, looking up from the ledger full of figures. Boone tore the envelope open and read the brief message inside. "He's surfaced again," he said, voice low. "Barrett, or whatever name he's using now, was spotted in Helena. He's trying to withdraw money from a bank under another alias." The air left Isla's lungs. "Helena? The bank in Helena?" Boone nodded. "The same one you sent your savings to, isn't it?" She stood abruptly, pulse racing. "I still have the transfer receipt. Maybe—" She ran to her room and rummaged through a small wooden chest beneath the bed. The paper was there, worn at the corners but still legible. First Montana Territorial Bank, Helena. "So that means," she whispered, barely daring to hope, "the money might still be there." Boone studied the paper, every letter, every mark. "If he hasn't withdrawn it yet, we have a chance to recover it. But I'll have to go." The room fell cold. Isla lifted her gaze, her lips pale. "You're leaving? Alone?" Boone gave a quiet nod, not avoiding her eyes. "I'm used to this kind of work. He can be dangerous, and Helena's 3 days' ride from here. I can't take you with me." "But what about me?" Her voice trembled. "You'll go and I'll stay here, waiting again?" Boone didn't answer. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. A horse neighed faintly in the yard. Isla stood in the middle of the room, fists clenched at her sides, holding herself together. "I've been left behind before, Boone," she said, her voice breaking. "Once was enough." He stepped closer, until the space between them felt thin as breath. His eyes held not command, but something quieter, the weight of a truth he could no longer keep to himself. "Isla," he said softly, "some promises are made to be forgotten, but some are made to be kept, no matter what it costs." He paused, gaze steady. "And I'm not a man who breaks a promise." She met his eyes, saw the steadiness there, the kind that steadied her in return. A part of her wanted to beg him to stay. Another part knew that if she did, he'd never forgive himself. Boone turned back to the desk, slipped the Pinkerton letter into his coat pocket. "I'll leave before sunrise. Jack and Martha will be here. Keep up with the ledgers." As if I'd never gone. Isla pressed her lips together and nodded. No words could hold back a man walking toward justice, especially one whose pain had been carved by the same crime. That night, she wrote him a short letter. No confession, no tears, only 4 simple lines. "If you find him, don't do it for me, do it for Boone, the sister you lost. I'll wait. Not the way I once did, but with a faith I finally believe is worth keeping." She folded the note and left it on his desk. Before dawn, she woke to the sound of hooves. Stepping onto the porch, she saw Boone fastening the saddle straps. The first light of morning fell across his shoulders in a faint gold glow. "You're leaving now?" she asked quietly. He turned toward her. "Before the sun climbs high. Sooner's better." She stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "Boone." He said nothing, only laid a hand on her shoulder, large, steady, warm through the fabric of her dress. "Isla," he murmured, his voice low and calm as the wind at daybreak. "Some promises are meant to be kept." She didn't answer. Boone pulled his hat low, mounted his horse, and rode off. His figure disappeared slowly into the pale horizon. Isla stood on the porch, the wind tugging strands of hair across her face. She wanted to call after him, but only whispered to herself, "Please don't vanish like the others." The sunlight spilled across the valley, touching the fence rails, the house and the place where she stood. And in that fragile moment, she felt something sharp and tender, the ache of being left behind, and the hope that this time someone might truly come back. All that day, the wind blew strangely. The sky was dull gray, wrapped in a haze that smelled of ash, a sign of early snow. Isla tidied Boone's desk, stacking the ledgers she'd finished, her heart restless. 14 days had passed since he'd left Hale Ranch. Each time the sound of hooves echoed from the hills, she'd rise from her chair, pulse quickening, only to find it was someone else. When the sun began to set, Scout's bark broke the quiet, sharp, frantic, unlike any other day. Isla rushed to the porch, her skirt sweeping across the steps, and froze. A lone rider was making his way up the trail, astride Boone's gray horse. He was slumped forward, swaying with each step. His face was pale beneath the dust of travel, his coat torn at the shoulder, a dark stain spreading down his sleeve. "Boone!" Isla cried, voice cracking as she ran across the yard. He tugged weakly at the reins, managing a faint smile when he saw her. "Told you," he whispered, "never bet against my promises." She couldn't even smile. Her hands shook as she reached for him just as he slipped from the saddle, his weight collapsing against her. The smell of blood, gunpowder, and dust clung to him, raw, real, overwhelming. "You're hurt," she stammered. "Not bad," Boone rasped, trying to steady himself, though his steps faltered. Isla tightened her grip around his waist, half carrying him toward the house. Martha gasped when they entered, then quickly set about boiling water and fetching clean cloth. Isla knelt beside the bed while Boone sat, barely keeping his eyes open. The wound on his shoulder was deeper than she'd feared. She washed the blood away, her hands trembling each time they brushed his skin. Boone clenched his jaw, trying not to make a sound, but now and then a quiet groan escaped. "You don't have to act so tough," she said softly, her throat tight. "I've seen blood before." Boone's lips curved faintly. "It's not the blood that's making you shake, Isla." She froze, breath catching, then continued wrapping the bandage in silence. By the time she was done, Boone had drifted into uneasy sleep, his forehead damp with sweat. Martha handed Isla a basin of water before slipping out quietly. "Stay with him," she murmured. "I'll brew some medicine." Night settled in. The wind howled against the windows, and Isla sat by the bedside, dabbing Boone's forehead with a cool cloth. For the first time she saw him fully, the broad brow, the dark lashes, the lines etched by years of sun and dust. Strength and weariness lived side by side on that face. "You came back," she whispered. "That's all that matters." Boone stirred, his hand moving through the air until it found hers. Isla startled, then stilled. His palm was rough and warm, his grip steady though weak. There was no demand in it, only quiet assurance. "I'm still here." He opened his eyes, their storm-gray depths flickering in the dim firelight. "Isla." She leaned closer, her voice a hush. "Don't speak. You need rest." Boone smiled faintly, eyes half-lidded. "I need to say this. Before I can't." He paused, breath shallow. "You're the reason I made it back. On the road, when I thought I wouldn't. I remembered your words. I'd promised to keep my word." Her eyes burned. "You did keep it. Because you made it worth keeping." Silence filled the room. Only the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind outside. Isla didn't know what moved her then. Compassion, faith, or the fear of losing again. She lowered her head, resting her forehead against his hand. Boone's fingers closed around hers, gentle, instinctive. No more words followed. Just two people, the warmth between them, and the rare peace that follows a long storm. Outside, snow began to fall, soft white flakes melting on the roof, dissolving into the glow from the hearth. Isla stayed beside him, keeping watch, until sleep overtook her too. Her head resting at the edge of the bed, her hand still locked in his. The fire burned low, its faint red light flickering over their quiet faces. And that night, beneath Montana's first winter snow, no words were needed. They both already knew. They had found each other. No one could tell when the snow had stopped. By morning, the entire valley lay under a sheet of white so pure it looked untouched, the light outside pouring through the window of the room where Boone lay. Isla eased the door open, carrying a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He was awake, leaning against the pillow, the gray in his eyes softening when he saw her. "Good morning," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Good morning," Boone replied, his tone hoarse from weariness but warm all the same. "You stayed up all night, didn't you?" Isla set the basin down. "I just kept the fire going." He nodded slightly. "And thanks to that, I didn't freeze solid." She laughed. A small sound, fragile, but enough to melt the awkwardness between them. Yet both of them knew something had shifted. The space between them was no longer that of employer and helper, rescuer and rescued. It had turned into something quieter, more fragile, and it made both their hearts tremble. Martha entered then, balancing a tray of porridge. "Well, looks like you two survived the night," she said, teasing as she set the tray down. Boone raised an eyebrow. "Thanks to Miss Carter here." Martha shot Isla a knowing glance. "Sometimes a woman showing up at the right time is heaven's mercy, Mr. Hale." Then she left, shutting the door behind her, leaving behind a silence that neither knew how to break. Boone ate a few spoonfuls before turning to Isla. "I owe you a thank you." "You've said that already," she replied, fingers fidgeting with the edge of the cloth. "Don't say it again." But what she didn't say, what pressed quietly inside her chest, was the fear that what she'd felt the night before might not have been real. Maybe his tenderness had been born of pain and gratitude, not love. Boone was a good man. She knew that. But kindness was not the same as affection. That afternoon, the snow began to melt. Isla helped Martha hang blankets on the porch, while Boone sat at his desk, writing slowly with an old steel pen. When Isla came in, he looked up. "I'm finishing my report for Pinkerton," he said. "The Barrett case, or whatever name he's hiding behind, it's over now. The law will take care of the rest." She stood beside him, eyes tracing the strong, deliberate strokes of his handwriting. "So, it's all finished?" Boone stopped writing and looked up at her. "Not everything. Some things have to end so others can begin." The words stilled her. There was no pretense in his gaze, only honesty, deep and quiet, the kind that made her want to believe him. Isla lowered her head slightly. "I'm glad you made it back." Boone studied her for a moment longer than needed, then nodded. "So am I." In the days that followed, Boone grew stronger. He began walking out to the stables again, though his shoulder was still stiff. Isla, without thinking, found herself stepping onto the porch. Each time she heard the gate creak open, just to catch sight of him. Once he turned and caught her watching. A faint smile crossed his lips, and she blushed, pretending to busy herself with the broom. Evenings fell into a gentle rhythm. She worked on the ledgers while he read or checked the mail. Martha saw everything but said nothing. Only sometimes she would set down 2 cups of tea instead of 1. "Cold nights are better shared," she'd say, before leaving them to the quiet glow of the fire. One night, when Boone went outside to tend the fire, Isla sat alone at the table, her small notebook open. She wrote verses, not for anyone to read, but to remind herself that she had survived a storm named love and betrayal. "I came to this land with empty hands, yet the earth gave me faith. Once lost among dust and wind, now my heart knows peace by name." She had just finished the final line when Boone returned. He set his coat aside and paused at the sight of the open notebook. "You write poetry?" he asked, a note of surprise in his voice. Startled, Isla reached to close it, but Boone gently laid a hand over the page, keeping it open. "It's beautiful," he said after a moment, scanning the words. "Peace is a rare thing out here, but it seems you've found it." The firelight flickered across his gray eyes. Isla didn't answer. She just looked at him for a long, quiet moment. There were no declarations, no words of affection, only a gaze, steady and full, that said everything words couldn't. Outside, the snow had fully stopped, leaving the ground damp with the scent of new grass. And inside that room, two people, one who had feared being left behind, and one who had stopped believing he could love again, sat together in silence, letting the fire warm the parts of their hearts they'd never dared to name. Spring came slowly to Hale Valley. The snow retreated in uneven patches, revealing dark, rich soil and the tender green of new shoots pushing through. Boone was back in the saddle again, the wound on his shoulder now only a faint scar. He spent his days outdoors, mending fences, training young ranch hands, and letting the land teach him patience once more. Isla, meanwhile, kept the ledgers in order, wrote letters to traders, and sometimes joined Martha down by the stream to wash clothes beneath the pale sun. Life had fallen into a quiet rhythm, steady, gentle, yet between them lingered something unspoken. It was no longer gratitude, nor debt. It was a waiting neither dared to name. One morning, Boone knocked on the office door where Isla sat among piles of papers. He wore his old hat and a freshly brushed coat. "I'll be heading to Helena for a few weeks," he said evenly. "There are documents to settle, the Barrett case and the bank records. It's time to close that chapter for good." Isla looked up, startled. "You're leaving again?" "Just this once," Boone said, stepping closer. His gaze softened. "When I come back, I hope you'll still be here." She smiled faintly, arranging the papers to hide her unease. "Unless Martha decides she's had enough of me, I'll still be here." Boone studied her for a heartbeat longer than needed, then nodded. "Then I'll ride easier." He left at dawn the next day. Isla stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching his figure fade beyond the ridge. His words echoed in her mind, somewhere between hope and stay. She didn't try to interpret them, yet her heart beat too fast to ignore. Days passed, then weeks. Without Boone, Hale Ranch felt quieter, as if it too held its breath. Isla kept her routine, rose early, cooked with Martha, managed the accounts. But each evening, when the light slanted across the valley, she found her eyes drawn to the road winding through the pines. 3 weeks later, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Scout barked wildly. Isla's heart leapt as she ran to the door. Boone was riding up the path, dust on his coat, sunlight glinting off the silver in his hair. He smiled, tired but content. "I told you," he said. "I keep my promises." She tried to answer, but her throat tightened. She only nodded, her eyes stinging with tears she couldn't explain. Boone stepped onto the porch and set down his leather satchel. "Good news," he said, pulling out a folded document stamped with the bank's seal. "Your account's been restored. Barrett never withdrew the funds. It's all still yours." Isla's breath caught. "You did this for me?" Boone shook his head. "No. I just went to reclaim what already belonged to you. The rest, what you do with it, that's yours to decide." In that moment, Isla understood. He had never tried to rescue her. He had simply given her the space to stand on, her own feet. And somehow, that made it impossible to walk away. Boone was quiet for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket. He drew out a small linen-wrapped box. Inside was an old gold ring, its stone worn by years, but still glowing softly in the afternoon light. "It belonged to my mother," Boone said gently. "She used to say no one's meant to live alone forever. I didn't believe her, Not until you came here. Isla stood still. The wind brushed past, lifting the ribbon at her waist. Boone, He didn't kneel. He didn't speak in rehearsed words. He simply stood before her, eyes steady and kind. I don't have much to promise except a life lived honestly. But if you choose to stay, not out of debt, not out of loneliness, but because it's what you want, then... He paused, a quiet smile touching his lips. I'd like to call you part of this home. Isla felt her heartbeat rise like the first day she'd stepped into this land. No fear this time, only clarity. About what she wanted. About who she wanted. She reached out, voice trembling but sure. Yes. Boone slipped the ring onto her finger. It was old, imperfect, yet it fit as if it had been waiting for her all along. They stood together on the porch as the evening wind rolled through the fields, the setting sun washing the valley in gold. Somewhere in the distance, water murmured over stones and a horse whinnied softly. Boone's hand found hers. Isla looked up at him and smiled. No one had saved the other. They had simply found, at last, the courage to choose each other, not out of fate, but out of freedom. Snow began to fall on the morning of their wedding. A soft, breath-like snow that dusted the hills and rooflines in white. The whole of Hale Valley shimmered under its quiet veil, so still that one could hear the distant rhythm of horse hooves echoing through the cold air. Isla stood at the upstairs window, looking out at the ribbons Martha had tied along the fence, swaying gently in the wind. Martha entered, holding a lace veil folded neatly in her hands. "This was mine when I was your age," she said, her voice rough but tender. "It's not worth much, but it's seen a happy life. I want it to see yours, too." Isla's eyes glistened. "Thank you, Martha." The older woman brushed back a strand of hair and fixed the veil atop Isla's low bun. "Some women are born to steady a man's heart," she said softly. "Not with words, with the way they live. You're one of them." Isla smiled through the tears threatening to fall. The chapel sat among the pines, half a mile from the ranch, small, built by Boone's own hands from local timber, plain but warm. When Isla arrived, her cream-colored dress brushed lightly over the snow, leaving a thin trail to the door. Boone waited there, wearing the one dark suit he owned, his hair neatly combed, his eyes calm and clear like the sky after a storm. The guests were few, neighbors, ranch hands, a few cowboys, and children from nearby farms who came for the snow as much as the celebration. They lined the narrow aisle with kind smiles and curious glances. Some whispered, not with scorn, but wonder. No one in these parts had ever seen a wedding like this. A white rancher from the frontier and a black woman from faraway Boston. But when Isla entered, the murmurs faded. There was something in the way she carried herself, her quiet grace, her smile steady as morning light, that left only reverence in the room. Boone stepped forward, taking her hand. "You really thought I'd show up?" she asked, her voice barely above the wind. He smiled. "Didn't know, but I hoped." The preacher spoke simply, his words humble, fitting for two souls who had learned life the hard way. When he asked if they would choose each other for life, Boone looked at Isla and said, "She stood by me when everything was broken. Since then, no other place has ever felt like home, except where she is." Isla met his gaze, voice clear and certain. You didn't save me. You taught me how to save myself. And I'm choosing you. Not because I need a place to stand, but because I want to walk beside you. Martha covered her mouth with her handkerchief, dabbing at her eyes. A boy from the neighboring ranch began to play the violin, the soft notes drifting through the wooden chapel. Sunlight filtered through the small window, glinting on their joined hands. Boone leaned close and whispered, "Just for her. You changed everything I knew about love." It wasn't a confession. It was a vow. Isla said nothing, only squeezed his hand in reply. The preacher smiled. "By the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife." Boone bent his head, his lips meeting hers. A kiss slow and sure, born not of passion, but of peace. Two weary hearts, finding rest at last. Applause broke out. Laughter mingled with the violin's tune. Outside, the snow fell steady, blanketing the chapel roof in a thin white layer, like nature itself had laid a bridal veil over the world. As they stepped out, neighbors tossed pine sprigs and grains of wheat in blessing. Boone draped his coat over Isla's shoulders, his hand never letting go of hers as they walked down the snowy path. The road back to Hale Ranch felt shorter this time. Above them, snowflakes melted into droplets on their sleeves. Isla glanced up at him, smiling softly. "I think," she said, "love doesn't always come from miracles. Sometimes it's made from the ordinary." Boone nodded, his gray eyes warm as firelight. And sometimes, the ordinary itself is the miracle. They walked on, hand in hand, as behind them the small chapel glowed faintly through the snow, a beacon of quiet light, marking the place where a love story didn't need proof, only presence. Summer came early that year, carrying the scent of cut hay and mornings warm enough to wake the valley before dawn. Hale Ranch had changed since the wedding, not just in the fences or the fields, but in the way life moved within it. Isla was no longer just the woman of the house. She was its rhythm. Each morning she and Martha went through the ledgers, checked orders, tallied the cost of seed and feed. By afternoon, she sat under the porch with the ranch hands' children, teaching them letters on a wooden slate. Their small fingers trembled as they traced the first strokes of the alphabet. And Boone often stood at the fence, arms crossed, quietly listening to the sound of their laughter mingling with the wind. He had never imagined that this land, once all dust and hoofbeats, could hold the sound of peace. In the late hours of day, when the light stretched long across the fields, Isla joined him to inspect the barns. Boone was expanding the west pasture, planning to breed a new line of horses. "Good horses are the future of this land," he said. Isla smiled. "And good bookkeeping is the future of good horses." Boone laughed, tipping his hat. "Yes, ma'am." But marriage, like the land, wasn't all sunshine. Isla was meticulous, weighing every expense. Boone was a man of instinct, acting first and thinking later. One afternoon, she found out he'd ordered lumber for a new stable without mentioning it. "Boone, you should have told me," she said, brows knit, ledger still open in her hands. He wiped his forehead, dust and sweat streaking his face. "Didn't think it was a big thing." "There's no such thing as a small thing when it concerns the future," she replied, her voice firmer than she meant. Boone was silent a moment, then exhaled slowly. "You're right. I'm just not used to asking anyone about what happens on this land." Isla set the book down and stepped closer. "I don't want you to ask permission. I just want to be heard." The quiet between them shifted. Boone's storm-gray eyes softened, and he nodded. "Heard," he said. "I can do that." After that, every choice became a conversation. They learned to ask, to argue gently, to stay even when tempers flared. The peace of Hale Ranch wasn't built on harmony, but on the decision to keep building, together. One night, under a sky crowded with stars, they sat on the porch in companionable silence. Crickets sang in the grass. The breeze carried the sweetness of harvest. Isla rested her head against his shoulder, the glow from the hearth behind them painting gold along her cheek. "Do you ever miss Boston?" she asked quietly. Boone chuckled. "Never been there. But I used to imagine it. A place full of lights and noise, full of things this land will never have." She was quiet for a moment. "I once thought love had to be like that too," she said softly. "Loud, bright, something that makes you dizzy." Boone turned to her, tracing his thumb along her hand. "And now?" Her dark eyes lifted, reflecting the starlight. "Now I know love doesn't need to shout. It just needs to let you be quiet and still feel safe. This quiet," she smiled faintly, "feels a lot like peace." Boone didn't answer. He simply bent his head and pressed a kiss to her hair, gentle, grateful. In the distance, the horses whinnied, the wind hummed through the rafters, and the air filled with the scent of hay and hearth smoke. Hale Ranch at night was still and alive, just like their love, not the kind that burned in a blaze, but the kind that endured, steady and warm. And in that silence, both of them knew. They weren't just rebuilding a ranch. They were rebuilding a life. Autumn burned bright before fading, leaving behind rows of crimson trees at the edge of Hale Valley. In the fields, Boone gathered hay into tall mounds, while Isla stood on the porch, one hand resting gently over her belly, where a new life was quietly taking root. The news of her pregnancy came like a miracle. Boone had stood silent for a long while before breaking into a smile, wide and unguarded, the kind that rarely touched his face. "A child," he said softly, his eyes bright. "We're going to have a child." Isla laughed through tears she hadn't realized were falling. He gathered her in his arms, holding her close, and pressed a kiss to her forehead. A wordless prayer of gratitude whispered into her hair. By the next morning, Boone was already working. He and a few men began building an extra room off the side of the house, its window facing east toward the pasture where the first light always fell. Isla watched from the doorway as he measured and hammered, the sound of wood meeting iron echoing like a heartbeat of hope. "What are you building?" she called. Boone didn't look up, only smiled. "Our child's room." The ranch hummed with new energy after that. Martha sewed quilts and knitted tiny hats, and whenever Isla mentioned possible names, the older woman would grin and say, "Choose one that means kindness. This baby feels like heaven's way of forgiving the world a little." When winter came, the hills turned white again. Isla moved more slowly, her steps careful, her belly round and heavy. Boone made sure she lifted nothing, kept warm water in the kitchen, and stacked the firewood high by the hearth. On the coldest nights, as wind whistled through the eaves, he sat beside the bed, reading bits of news from the Helena Gazette, or telling her stories about his father, the man who had once built the first fences of Hale Ranch with bare hands and stubborn hope. One night, Isla reached for his hand, her voice faint but serene. Boone, if something happens, tell our child I loved them, even before they existed. Boone squeezed her hand tight. No if, Isla. You and the baby are both going to be here when spring comes. But that winter was harsher than any before. The wind screamed for 3 days straight, and the snow rose past their knees. Then, amidst the storm, Isla went into labor. Boone panicked like a man who'd never known fear until that moment. Martha's voice cut through his confusion, firm and calm. Boil water! Get towels! The house filled with the sounds of footsteps, wind, and Isla's cries, each one carving itself into Boone's chest. Hours passed, slow, endless, and cruel. Boone knelt by the door, hands clenched, his back against the cold wooden wall. Then came Martha's shout, followed by a sound so pure it silenced the storm, the cry of a newborn, sharp and alive. Boone sprang to his feet. The door opened, and Martha appeared, sweat streaking her hair, but joy shining in her eyes. They're both fine, she said. A girl. He stepped inside and stopped cold. Isla lay there, exhausted but smiling, the baby bundled in a knitted blanket against her chest. Boone dropped to his knees, touching a fingertip to the baby's cheek. She opened her eyes, pale gray, just like his. What shall we call her? He asked softly. Isla looked down at the child and whispered, Grace, Grace Hale, because she was born of mercy and forgiveness. Boone nodded, his voice rough with emotion. Grace, fitting. The world's a little kinder with her in it. He leaned down and kissed Isla's forehead, whispering, No more waiting, Isla. You're home now. Outside, snow still fell, soft and steady, blanketing the porch in white. Inside, the fire crackled, its glow wrapping the room in warmth. Boone watched the two of them, something in his chest settling for the first time in his life, the feeling of belonging. He placed his hand gently over the baby's tiny fingers, speaking as though making a vow to the air itself. No more loneliness, no more waiting. This is home now. And in the hush of fire and falling snow, that promise lingered, quiet, certain, and as lasting as the spring waiting beyond the storm. Years passed, and the winds of Montana changed their song. Hale Valley was no longer the dry, cracked stretch of land it once was. It had turned lush and wide, green as far as the eye could see. The creek curved like a silver ribbon through the fields, catching the late sun as it flowed past the ranch. Cattle called to one another in the distance, their voices mingling with the laughter of children, the sounds of peace in a place that Isla and Boone had spent a lifetime building. On the porch of the old wooden house, Isla sat in her rocking chair. Her hair was silver now, her face marked with the soft lines of years, but her eyes held the same calm warmth as the day he first saw her. Below, their children played. Grace, now grown into a graceful young woman, chased her younger siblings through the golden light, while the family's old dog bounded alongside. The sight made Isla smile. Boone stepped out onto the porch, broad-shouldered still, though his hair had gone gray at the temples. In his hands were 2 steaming cups of tea. He handed one to her before sitting down beside her, their silence filled with the quiet rhythm of years shared. Hard to believe this used to be nothing but dust, he said, his gaze sweeping over the valley. You look around now, and there's no trace left of what it once was. Isla took a sip of tea, smiling softly. That's because we didn't run. We stayed. For a while, neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of cut grass and the calls of birds returning to their nests. The setting sun poured gold over the plains, washing the fences and trees in a light so gentle that even time seemed to hesitate. "Ever regret coming here?" Boone asked quietly, his voice low as the evening wind. Isla turned to him, her eyes catching the last glimmer of sunlight. In them he saw the reflection of every season they had weathered, the losses, the labor, the love that had grown steady and deep. "If I hadn't waited in that dust all those years ago," she said, her voice tender, "I'd never have found you." Boone smiled faintly, his rough hand finding hers. "And if I hadn't stopped at that horse station, I'd still be a man running from his own ghosts." They sat together, hand in hand, as the light waned. Around them, the world seemed to pause, the wind, the footsteps, even the breath of the land itself, all quiet, as if in reverence for what they had built. Inside, Martha, her hair now as white as snow, rocked their youngest grandchild to sleep. She'd often said the land remembered kindness, and now it was plain to see. The valley thrived because of it. Families nearby farmed and prospered, their wells full, their fields alive, all because Isla and Boone had once taught them how to plant, how to water, and most of all, how to believe in tomorrow. Boone watched the last light fade beyond the hills. "I used to think love was a fire," he said quietly. "Something that burns bright and dies fast. But it's more like this land. If you're patient, it comes back to life." Isla rested her head against his shoulder, smiling. "We didn't come here to find love, Boone. We came to learn how to grow it." He squeezed her hand gently, warmth flowing between their palms. Down below, Grace called out, "Mama, Papa, look, the sunset." Isla laughed softly, waving back. "Remember, darling, every sunset is a reminder that we've lived another good day." Boone looked at her, his chest full of quiet gratitude, for the land, for the years, for her. "From loss," he said, "to fullness, from dust to home." The last rays of sun fell across them, turning the porch to gold. Isla turned toward him, her voice barely more than a breath. "We've lost so much, Boone, but somehow we found everything." He nodded, eyes glinting with the same calm certainty as the land around them. "We healed it, Isla, and it healed us right back." The wind carried the scent of earth and laughter. Behind the hills, the sun slipped away, leaving behind a sky streaked in orange and rose, a ribbon of grace across the horizon. And there they sat, two souls who had once been lost, now home at last, tending the land they had mended with love, faith, and time. If this story reminds you of someone who's walked beside you through the long seasons of life, share a memory in the comments below, because somewhere in your words, another love story may take root beneath these same western skies. Thank you for listening. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep the light of kindness alive through every sunset.